What's up, everybody? Good evening. Welcome to this evening's live stream. Very happy to be back on for the second time today, back in the office, and we're going to be talking tonight with Travis Shaw, the Public Programs Coordinator for the Mosby Heritage Area Association. And we're going to be talking about the Beeline March and the making of an American myth. What's up, buddy? How are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm getting in the groove of doing these live streams all the time.
Yeah, like I was just saying, you know, we've been learning on the go, but you were really ahead of the curve as far as this went. So,
I know I was made for a pandemic, I guess, huh?
I guess, you don't mind, I'm just going to take a second to share this over to
Sure.
the Mosby Heritage Area so that people watching there can watch.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for tuning in already. I know it's 7 o'clock on the button, and we're going to be having people coming in and out for most of the evening. I see Mike Froning is on. He's all the way from Maine. He's usually the first one on. So Mike, what's up, buddy? And we're going to be sharing this out over on the Mosby Heritage Area Association page as well. So you can check that out. If you need to go over and like that page, please do so as well. We get some traffic going on both sides of the equation here. So Travis, tell everyone a little bit about yourself who hasn't been introduced to you yet. There are a couple people that are newcomers who have never seen you on here before.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Travis Shaw. As John said, I'm with the Mosby Heritage Area Association. That's a 5-county heritage area in Northern Virginia, where we promote historical education and historical preservation work. We go into schools, we talk to kids, we put on live programs throughout the year, everything from book talks to battlefield tours to a conference every fall. We also work a lot with local landowners to get land under preservation easements. It's a pretty remarkable landscape, very well preserved landscape, and you know, we really work to try and keep it that way. We think there's something special about being able to go where history happened and see it much as people did 100, 150, 200 years ago.
And you guys have some amazing, this is kind of out of the blue, but you guys have some amazing roads down there, like roads that haven't been touched since the 19th century.
Yeah, that's a point of pride and for some people contention.
Yeah.
Down in, especially in the southern part of Loudoun County and northern Fauquier County, we've got something like 300 miles of unpaved roads. And as you said, a lot of them have not been touched since the Civil War. So, you know, as you walk down these roads, you're basically following in the literal footsteps of the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Northern Virginia.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. And I love that area down there, and it's amazing. So anyone who hasn't been there, you need to check this, you need to check that part of the world out. I love that northern part of the Virginia and down through that area. It's great. And I also know that your love is in the 18th century.
Yes, yeah. Although I work for an organization that does a lot of 19th century history, my interest, my love is definitely with the 18th century, and specifically with the time around the American Revolution. So thankfully, that's what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, we're going all the way back to 1775. So this would be good, because usually a lot of people are being inundated with Civil War on my page lately, because I've been working alongside the CWI. So it'd be nice to have some 18th century stuff. So why this topic, Travis? Why do you want to talk about this tonight?
Oh man, I think this is an absolutely fascinating topic. You know, the formation of these rifle companies is really the birth of the United States Army. You know, the order that gives, you know, Congress authorizes the raising of these 10 rifle companies happens on June 14th, 1775. And this is the first time Congress calls for troops from colonies outside of New England. And so it's the date that we mark the birth of the United States Army. You know, if you look at the seal of the Army or on any Army flags, or talk to anyone who's ever been in the Army, that date, June 14th, is a huge one. So it's fascinating from that aspect. The actual events that transpire that summer are really interesting too. In a lot of ways, I think it's one of the most remarkable stories from the American Revolution. And then, as we kind of alluded to, it also gives rise to a very pervasive kind of myth or legend within the United States military and within American history. And I definitely want to touch on that as well. So.
That'd be awesome. So what is the situation like in 1775 in the American colonies?
Okay, so in June of 1775, we've got, kind of the nucleus or the core of what will become the Continental Army, and it's besieging the British in Boston. They're arranged in Cambridge and around Boston. It's at this point mostly New Englanders, almost all New Englanders, really drawing from the militias that had existed up there before the start of hostilities. And as I said, on June 14th, Congress authorizes the raising of troops from other colonies. And specifically, they're going to call for the raising of 10 companies of riflemen. 6 are supposed to come from Pennsylvania, 2 from Maryland, and 2 from Virginia. To quote that, each company, as soon as completed, shall march and join the army near Boston, to be employed as light infantry under the command of the chief officer in that army. So again, directly under Washington's command. As I said, this marks the birth of the United States Army. When they're raised, it really is the moment where the Continental Army truly becomes continental. Up until this point, it's strictly a New England army. And so this is showing that the other colonies, these southern colonies, are willing to put in, the blood, sweat, and tears to this cause as well. And as I said, it's also an important moment kind of psychologically, because it's the birth of this kind of mythos of the American rifleman. And we'll see this pop up not only during the Revolution, but, on up to the modern day, the idea that this, rugged individual, this guy who doesn't want to take orders, this warrior who with his own 2 hands can change the course of history, really comes out of these volunteers that are raised in 1775. And I'll get way more into that as we go on. But so I don't really want to dwell too much on the Pennsylvania companies, because they have kind of a different history. Pennsylvania is supposed to raise 6 companies. They end up raising 10. So they basically form their own regiment and have a very separate experience. But these Maryland and Virginia companies have a very, they're kind of linked throughout this experience. So just to give you like a little bit of background on the 4 guys chosen to lead these Maryland and Virginia companies, all 4 are experienced military men. Most have had experience either in the French and Indian War or in Dunmore's War in 1774. A lot of the men who will fill the ranks are also experienced in those kind of frontier conflicts. The youngest officer that was chosen was Michael Cressup of Maryland. He's 33 when his company is formed. He is the son of Thomas Cressup, famous Maryland frontiersman. This guy has fought in all the frontier conflicts that Maryland has been involved in the kind of mid 18th century. His son, Michael, follows in his footsteps. He's Indian trader, Indian fighter out in the Ohio country. So again, this guy's got the pedigree. He's known as a fighter. The other Maryland company will be led by a guy named Thomas Price. He's 42. So older, kind of older than we think of when we think of officers in the 18th century. Price is kind of a political appointee. He's seen some experience during the French and Indian War, but in 1775, he's actually serving in the Maryland Committee of Observation. So, the kind of this political part of the Revolution. Over in Virginia, though, we have probably the most famous of the 4 officers, and that is going to be Daniel Morgan, guy that goes on to quite a bit of fame as the Revolution goes on. Born in New Jersey, moves to Virginia as a teenager, becomes famous as, kind of this hard frontiersman, a brawler, serves during the French and Indian War and during Dunmore's War. And by the time that this company is raised in 1775, he's 38. So again, these guys are kind of older than a lot of their contemporary officers would be at the time. And then lastly, we have Hugh Stevenson, who will command the other Virginia company. Stevenson, we don't know as much about him, unfortunately. We know that he was a veteran of the French and Indian War, Dunmore's War, but other than that, the record is pretty sketchy on him. But yeah, we have these 4 guys, Cressup, Price, Morgan, and Stevenson, who will command these companies as they prepare to march north to assist Washington. The 2 Maryland companies will form in Frederick. and they'll be drawn largely out of Frederick County. Now, Frederick County, Maryland at the time is everything kind of west of Baltimore, pretty much, or everything kind of northwest of Washington. So some will come from what's modern Frederick County, some will come as far away as, the very western edge of Maryland, out in the frontier. The two Virginia companies, Morgan's company will be raised in Winchester.
Okay.
And Hugh Stevenson's company will be raised in the village of Mecklenburg, which is now Shepherdstown on the Potomac. Of course, now in West Virginia, but at the time it was Berkeley County, Virginia. And all of those companies will kind of get together at the same time. The Frederick companies, June 21st, and then the two Virginia companies, they'll start to muster June 22nd. So it's only, about a week after that order comes out of Congress that these men are already starting to assemble. One of the things we see in 1775, kind of like in many other wars, is in the first few months of the conflict, people are raring to go. They see this as an adventure. They see it as the patriotic thing to do. The populace hasn't been kind of ground down by the attrition and by the depredations of war yet. There's still very much this rage militaire going on. So these companies start to gather in late June. One of the things that holds them up is they have to wait for arms and other equipment. So all the kind of small gunsmith shops in central Maryland and Western Virginia are going to be turning out rifles for these guys. One of the examples I particularly love is in Shepherdstown. There's the Sheets brothers making rifles. Now, it's not Sheets like the gas station chain, but
yeah.
If you go to Shepherdstown today and you stand in the middle of town, there's a Chinese restaurant, little brick Chinese restaurant.
Okay.
Near the college. That was the Sheets rifle shop. So guns for Hugh Stevenson's company were made there, where you can now go and get Chinese takeout. So I do love that.
Wow. Now, were these guys? We had a question. It's one that I thought of too. Did these guys receive a bounty for volunteering, or did they just volunteer and go?
Yes, they are paid for volunteering. Absolutely. I do not, off the top of my head, remember what the payment is, but
right.
So.
And this is in direct response to Lexington and Concord. Basically, the Continental Congress issues this based on what they've heard about Lexington and Concord.
Yeah, so it's a few months after Lexington and Concord. After Lexington and Concord, the British kind of get bottled up there in Boston, and things pretty much hit a stalemate through May and early June. Okay. Now, of course, almost immediately after this order is given, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill, which kind of changes the situation a little bit, shows the British that the Americans are capable of not only standing and fighting, but inflicting horrendous casualties. But even after Bunker Hill, that does not break the siege of Boston. You have this kind of ragtag army surrounding the city, and then the British hold up within the city itself. And, with all the accompanying issues of being under siege, they're running out of food, they're running out of firewood, disease is starting to break out in the city. So it's not a tenable position for the British necessarily, but Washington really doesn't have the troops, the heavy artillery to break the siege either. So,
okay.
And it's hoped that maybe these riflemen might help tip the balance.
So how far do they have to travel? They got to go from Winchester to Boston then.
Yes, so this is what I think is really the most remarkable thing about this march. Is they call it the Beeline March because by about mid-July, these companies are ready to go, and according to the legend, according to kind of the tradition, Morgan was supposed to let Stevenson know when they were going to march so that the companies could march to Boston together. He did not. He leaves Winchester on July 14th. Stevenson finds out the next day that they've already started to march.
Wow.
So Morgan will leave July 14th. Stevenson leaves Shepherdstown July 17th. And then the two Maryland companies will leave Frederick on the 18th. So all within a few days of one another. All told, these companies are going to have to march about 600 miles to Boston. And that's 600 miles on 18th century roads. You know, there are roads connecting these places, but they're unpaved dirt roads. It's the middle of summer. I can't imagine how dusty it would be, how muddy it is when it rains. One of the soldiers in Stevenson's company actually leaves an account of the march, which is really cool because you can track their progress. You know, they leave from Shepherdstown, they cross the Potomac, they cross what would later, 80 something years later be the Antietam battlefield. You know, they march through Sharpsburg and up to Keedysville area, to Frederick, Hanover, and York, Pennsylvania, all the way up, eventually to Cambridge. Now, this is what is so remarkable about this. Each one of these companies are able to make that march in about 22, 23 days, about 3 weeks.
Jeez.
Now, we when we talk about the Civil War, we give a lot of credit to Jackson and his foot cavalry. You know, these guys are doing like 30-mile marches.
Yeah.
These guys are averaging that for like 3 weeks straight. It's not just a day or 2 or 3 of marching like that. This is, they're averaging like 25 miles a day for 3 weeks straight in the middle of summer.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets the name the Beeline March. It's usually specifically applied to Stevenson, but I think it really applies to any of these 4 companies. These guys made a beeline for Boston, and were able to arrive in, I think it's astounding that they are able to do that.
Oh yeah, and on 18th century roads. I mean, come on.
That's cool. In Bedinger writes actually in Stevenson's company, they leave with, I think it's 89 men, right around there, and they only lose 2 along the way.
Wow.
It's remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, because you hear about losing 2 in a day on, in a company in the Civil War and all that. And it's 2 guys fell out of line 5 miles down the road. These guys are losing 2 on the whole march.
Yeah, and I mean, I really think it speaks to the enthusiasm that these guys had. There's a certain kind of esprit de corps that comes with them as well, which again will play into this myth that arises from the Beeline March. Many of these men come from the frontier or areas that had been the frontier within the past generation or so. They certainly see themselves as a little different from, the settled farmers of Eastern Pennsylvania or New York as they're passing through these communities. As they come into these communities, there's a great account when they enter Frederick. Some of the guys paint themselves up like Indians and are like whooping and hollering as they come in. They really wanted to show off, and they certainly do so. A lot of times when they'd stop in these towns, they'd put on shooting demonstrations to show just how good they were at marksmanship. So there's a certain cockiness to it that I really like. And again, it plays into that our ideal of this, American rifleman, these rugged sons of the forest who, again, they don't take crap from anyone. They don't follow orders. They're their own kind of individuals. So I think that plays into a lot of it. None of these men wanted to be considered cowards or wanted to be considered soft or weak. So.
As we know, with the revolution, it's basically our own kind of first Civil War in that regard, and not everyone's for the colonists and all this other stuff. Did they meet any kind of backlash along the route from people who just didn't care, didn't want to associate with them or anything?
Bedinger's account actually mentions running into one loyalist, someone that kind of treats them rudely, and they don't really seem to take it into too much account. For the most part, the people, the communities that they're marching through are fairly supportive. It's, again, I think that kind of speaks to the way the revolution plays out. Again, a lot of what we identify as loyalist sentiment or resistance to the patriot cause, a lot of that is kind of war exhaustion. These people, once the war drags on several years, Congress starts asking for more and more money, more and more supplies, more and more men from their communities. And I think that's going to turn a lot of people against them. They're also tending to march through areas that, you know, aren't really known for a heavy loyalist presence. You know, Eastern Pennsylvania may have a lot of, you know, for instance, Quakers or German pacifists who are neutral, but they're not necessarily out and out aggressively pro-British at this point. You know, they're not going through the parts of like, you know, New Jersey or Western Pennsylvania or, you know, areas where there's super strong loyalist commitment. And also, you know, I think a lot of loyalists had the good sense to keep their heads down when they see hundreds of guys painted like Indians whooping through the town, you know?
Yeah. What did these guys look like? What was their material culture like?
Oh man, great question. So we have a lot of accounts of what they look like, written by people who watched them march along the way. You know, one quote says, you know, they were remarkably stout and hardy men, many of them exceeding 6 feet in height. They're dressed in white frocks or rifle shirts and round hats. And, you know, that's something that appears over and over again in these eyewitness descriptions. You know, they're not issued a uniform when they leave, but they are extremely uniform in their appearance. Most of them, first of all, are wearing hunting shirts. The hunting shirt is a really fascinating, entirely American garment. It appears kind of Western Virginia in the 1760s, spreads to like Maryland, Pennsylvania by the time the Revolution starts. And, you know, I wish I'd grabbed one from upstairs, but, you know, it's a linen shirt. It's split down the front. It's got a cape with fringe on it. You know, if we think of our stereotypical frontiersmen, you kind of have that in your mind. It's, you know, by the time 1775 rolls around, at least in Virginia, it's become very much a political statement. You know, wearing one of these shows that you're a supporter of America or of American independence. And these guys are going to be wearing these hunting shirts. A lot of them will be wearing things like, you know, Indian style wool leggings or moccasins, again, as symbols of that they've come from the frontier. Again, yes, 600 miles in a pair of moccasins is crazy. So even though they're not issued uniforms, they are going to all be dressed fairly similarly as they march north. They're all going to be carrying rifles, which is another thing that really sets them apart from most soldiers in 1775. You know, rifling is not a new technology in 1775. You know, it's been around for centuries. It's brought to the Americas by specifically German communities. So where you see rifle culture in 1775 is typically where you find the most Germans. So like where they're recruiting these rifle companies from, you know, like Pennsylvania, you know, Pennsylvania Dutch country. Lancaster is a huge rifle, you know, center of rifle making activity. Frederick County, Maryland, lots of rifle makers there, down into Mecklenburg or Shepherdstown, you know, Winchester. Now the rifle has a huge advantage over a smoothbore musket in terms of accuracy. You know, you're talking about twice the accurate distance as a musket, but it will have several downsides, and we can get into like how much of a disadvantage this gives these guys later on. You know, for one, firing a rifle is much slower to load and fire. You've got to measure the powder. You've got to patch the ball with a cloth patch to make sure it grips the rifling. You've got to ram that down, which comes harder and harder as the rifle becomes fouled. The other big disadvantage is rifles don't mount bayonets. So these riflemen, as we'll unfortunately find out a little later on, are pretty helpless when it comes to hand-to-hand combat. So hopefully that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that Neil Hurst was on here earlier saying all the hunting shirt makes its appearance in New England.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you see a lot of is the descriptions of these guys are coming from New Englanders who have never seen a hunting shirt before.
Oh, really?
Like, this is like a weird shirt. It's got fringe. It looks kind of like a wagoner's smock, except it's split down the front. And it's amazing because within a few months or a few years, the hunting shirt really transcends this regional identity and becomes broadly used throughout America. George Washington recommends it as a uniform for Continental troops. It's cheap to make, it's easy to put together. It will give the guys at least some semblance of a uniformed appearance. And if you want to learn about hunting shirts, Neil Hurst is absolutely the guy to go to. His thesis on hunting shirts is really a great material culture study. I can't think of any better.
Are they easier for sizing as well, or because they seem like they fit a little looser than some other garments do?
Yeah, I mean, they're when the Continental Army starts wearing these things, they really start churning them out very quickly. They I don't think they're not as fitted as a uniform coat would be at all. It's kind of a smart. One of the things Washington says is you can, in the cold weather, you can layer it over things. So they're pretty loose fitting garments.
Yeah. When these guys make this trek, how are they accepted by the troops when they get there, or the militias when they get there? Who are these New Englanders who see these guys for the first time and such?
This is a really, really fun story. So, there's a great quote from James Warren, who writes to John Adams in August, on August 9th. He says, four captains, he's talking about the British, 4 captains and a subaltern were killed at the beginning of last week, chiefly by the riflemen, and I'm persuaded they will do great execution. He says there's one company here last week. On Sunday, a fine company came in from Virginia. Yesterday morning, 3 more companies came. He never saw a finer fellow. So, this is, again, one of those moments where the Continental Army really starts to transcend just being a New England army. So they're really initially greeted. The New Englanders are ecstatic to see these guys. And the fact that they've come so far to support them is something that these guys are really impressed by. And, of course, they're impressed by their marksmanship. Another eyewitness says these men are remarkable for the accuracy of their aim, striking a mark with great certainty at 200 yards. So again, we're talking, maybe double the distance of a smoothbore musket. Washington actually orders a demonstration of their skills at one point. Where they're firing at targets from 200, 250 yards away. One of the things that I really like is a Pennsylvania paper publishes this letter to a British newspaper in London. It says, this province has raised 1,000 riflemen who will put a ball on a man's head at 150 or 200 yards. We therefore advise your officers who are coming to America to settle their affairs in England before they depart. So it's a propaganda, triumph for the Americans, at least at first. And what we'll see over the next few weeks once they arrive is, they really they make a name for themselves harassing the British. Like, they're not necessarily killing a lot of British soldiers, but any British soldier that's putting his head up, who's within rifle range, is going to have like balls flying at him. They're picking off isolated sentries. Some of the British officers start taking some of their rank insignia off because they're afraid of being hit. But there's always a but. Yeah. On the other hand, things aren't always so rosy as time goes on. These riflemen are initially excused from fatigue duty. So you have all these New Englanders who are busting their butts, digging trenches and building fortifications, while these Southerners are just kind of laying around taking pot shots at the British.
Yeah.
We tend to think of regional or like sectional animosity as a 19th century thing, but it absolutely exists in the 18th century. Many of these men have never been outside of their home state. They've never met a Southerner before. These Southerners have never met a New Englander before. So you will see discipline kind of go to hell very quickly as the fall drags on. A lot of fighting, a lot of drunkenness. Some of the riflemen desert because, they didn't sign up for this. They wanted to fight the British, not sit around in trenches for weeks on end. Yeah. There's a quote by Artemus Ward, this New England general who's up there. He says, "They don't boast so much of the riflemen as heretofore. General Washington has said he wished they'd never come. and General Lee has damned them and wished them all in Boston. But again, as we'll get to, this kind of plays into the myth. You know, Americans love a rebel. You know, Americans love a badass who doesn't listen to anyone else, who doesn't follow orders. And that's really what they're getting here in the late summer and the early fall of 1775. You know, these riflemen have a reputation for being kind of wild.
So initially they have like they're doing like almost psychological warfare on the enemy.
Yes.
Because they're picking them off at long distances and they're like, hey, you better keep your head down because those riflemen are out there, and that plays into your psyche, you know.
Absolutely.
And then all of a sudden they're getting in the heads of their comrades now because they're just loafing around because they have orders that, you know, they got permission not to do anything as far as fatigue duty is concerned. It's kind of like, wow, this really flips the script on them for a little bit.
Yeah, it's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because going back to the hunting shirt thing, one of the things Washington says when he recommends that they use them as uniforms is he's like, if all of the men are wearing hunting shirts, the British are going to assume that we're all marksmen.
Right.
We're going to assume we're all hardcore riflemen, and you know, that's going to play into the psyche. Now, whether that was true or not, I couldn't really say, but
yeah,
it is kind of funny.
That's amazing. And it is true. It is like it's the quintessential American story where it's like the rough guy from, you know, backwoods America coming out to, you know, it's the Sergeant York story.
I was gonna bring him up later because he is absolutely a direct descendant, you know, of these riflemen of 1775. You know, we see it with Sergeant York. We see it, you know, even during the Civil War with the sharpshooter companies that are raised, and kind of this reputation that I think kind of is more inflated than their actual impact on the battlefield. You know, not to denigrate Sergeant York, because obviously, I mean, he was absolutely a remarkable guy. We see it today. I mean, look at, you know, the movie American Sniper. I mean, that's a clear line going back to 1775.
Right. And a lot of people who do stolen valor say they're a sniper. When you think about it, I mean, I've had friends who are vets who have pulled people out and said that stolen valor guy, whatever, and they're like, I knew it because the way he had his patches, but they're always like sniper or special forces or something like that. It goes back to this mythology.
Yeah, no one really wants to fake that they were like, you know,
a clerk,
like logistics or something like that, driving a truck.
Yeah, right. It's a quintessential American thing. Everyone wants to be a sniper.
Right, because, you know, they're operating alone or in a small team. You know, they're out there behind enemy lines or on the very, you know, tip of the spear kind of thing. Nobody wants to be the average soldier. I mean, you play a lot of video games. I know that, like, you know, when you're playing a game like Battlefield or something, everybody wants to be the sniper, you know?
Yeah, and I'm the guy who just wants to throw the most lead down range as possible. You know, give me the musket, I'll be fine. But yeah, how does this impact the units going forward in the war? How does this change? Because they're already getting psychologically into the heads of the British. The British are changing their uniforms now, which is a really cool thing in warfare that we don't often talk about, is how men adapt their uniform to their situation. I think that's a really cool thing that we don't touch on a lot, material culture wise, outside of the reenacting hobby. We don't touch on it a lot, you know, and but it's so cool to see how this transitions into the future.
Yeah, so in the fall of 1775, these four companies are going to undergo really fundamental change. They're almost unrecognizable by the time the year is over. First of all, Daniel Morgan's company is taken out of the lines at Boston and sent to Maine. They're going to be part of the failed assault on Quebec on New Year's Eve of 1775. Cressup will die in October. He's actually ill during the march. He makes it to Boston, and then he's actually trying to return home to Maryland, and he dies in New York City. Price ends up getting promoted in January, so he'll become an officer in the 2nd Maryland Regiment. So the only original captain left by January of '76 is Hugh Stevenson. and he's going to be there kind of in general command of these companies when the siege of Boston ends in March. You know, the British evacuate Boston, sail to Halifax. What's left of the rifle companies will march south with the army to New York. And they'll be in New York in June, just as the city is expecting an attack by the British, when their enlistments expire. You know, these guys enlisted for a year. That runs out just as New York is expecting an attack by the British. Many of the men will choose to re-enlist. Again, kind of a testament to their patriotism or to, you know, the cause that they believe in. And what happens is they take the survivors of these companies, stick them in with a few recently raised companies from Maryland, Virginia, and form what is known as the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment. And Stevenson will command that. And they'll take part in all the battles around New York that happened during the summer and fall of 1776. One of the coolest quotes of the Revolutionary War, I think, when the British fleet arrives off of New York, one of these riflemen, a Marylander named Daniel McCurtain, actually writes, "I thought all of London was afloat," because you can imagine just, you know, the largest fleet anyone has ever seen in the New World, basically, descending on New York, and these guys just, you know, it's the Empire Strikes Back. It's
right.
Face.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like,
exactly. Yeah. Literally, the Empire Striking Back. You know.
But there is kind of a sad epilogue to this regiment. They will take part in the defense of Fort Washington on November 16th of 1776. It's one of the last continental strongholds on Manhattan, you know, kind of last toehold on New York. And they will be in the trenches defending this fort against a British and Hessian assault. And what they find, you know, I alluded earlier to some of the drawbacks of the rifles, you know, this slow rate of fire, the inability to really participate in close combat, that is going to be, you know, lead to their destruction, essentially. You know, misfires start happening, rifles get fouled very quickly. Some of the men would resort to rocks in hand-to-hand combat. You know, a German officer writes, "These terrible men deserve more pity than fear. They want nearly 15 minutes to load their pieces, and during that time, they feel our balls and our bayonets." And this is a really, you know, shows a fundamental shift. You know, in less than a year, the British have gone to being kind of suspect or fearful of these guys, to figuring out how to stop them. You know, if their rate of fire is so slow, if they can't fight in close combat, you know, the British, despite what we think we know about the Revolution, are very tactically aggressive and very adaptable. They find the best way to overcome riflemen is to take them in close combat. You know, you can cover 100 yards pretty quick if you're running. And while these guys are trying to load their pieces, they will get overrun. Most of the survivors of that battle at Fort Washington, you know, they're captured. Most will die in British prison ships over the next few years. So it's, you know, as I said, a pretty sad epilogue, but it does lead to some interesting tactical developments. You know, as the war goes on, both the Americans and the British really perfect how to use riflemen and how to incorporate them into their armies in effective ways.
Were they ever seen as negative as far as when they targeted officers or anything like that? Was that because that seems to be something that going forward seems to be a negative thing for years, and I didn't know if that's a connotation that's given to them for it, or is it kind of like you're just picking off the right person?
I mean, certainly in a lot of writing after the fact, you know, we have this idea of 18th century warfare as being like super gentlemanly and like you're not supposed to target officers and things like that. But, you know, riflemen on both sides, both in the British and the American armies, are going to be doing it throughout the war. That really becomes one of their uses on the battlefield. You know, they might not be able to stand in line of battle the way that musket armed troops would be able to. You know, they can't throw the lead down range that a musket armed, you know, regiment can. but they are going to find a niche, targeting officers, targeting artillerymen, kind of high profile, high value targets at long distances. One thing that the British will do is, the British, they have their own riflemen. They'll start issuing rifles to men in light infantry companies. So you have a mixture of rifle and musket armed troops. They also have German riflemen, the Jaegers, recruited from gameskeepers and hunters in Central Europe. And the Americans will do the same thing. One of the high points, I guess you could say, of Daniel Morgan's career and of the use of riflemen is it comes at the Battle of Saratoga, when Morgan's riflemen will wreak such havoc on British officers at Saratoga. Well, one of the reasons they're able to do that so effectively is they're backed up by Henry Dearborn's light infantry. So they have about 300 light infantrymen with them, with muskets, with bayonets, who can, put lots of fire downrange, and who can also back them up with bayonets as the British advance, as they get too close. So by the end of the war, you see both sides really kind of using what we now kind of refer to as combined arms, I guess you could say, high volume of fire, suppression fire, and then very accurate fire at high value targets.
Did these men have any kind of sharpened weapons for hand-to-hand combat or anything like that? Because they can't have a bayonet, and you have a line of British coming at you with bayonets. It's kind of like, or did they just use weapons as like clubs or muskets or rifles?
When they set out for Boston, a lot of them will be carrying like scalping knives and tomahawks and stuff. Hunting swords, kind of short swords. That kind of stuff, I would imagine is probably pretty dubious in terms of hand-to-hand combat if you're facing men with bayonets. They certainly, I guess it's part of, again, that psychological idea that these guys are kind of half feral coming from the frontier. They're going to scalp you and tomahawk you like a Native American would.
Right.
But I'm not sure how effective that would be. At one point in the war, there's actually plans drawn up to issue folding pikes to riflemen.
Wow.
In the event that like cavalry charge at them, they'd be able to fight them off with a small pike. That doesn't really happen. I think they find that the most effective way to utilize these guys is to use them in combined formations. The British will develop, famously the Ferguson rifle, which doesn't see a lot of use during the Revolution. It's only used, very limited handfuls. But this is a breech loading rifle, and it's actually like a screw. You unscrew the trigger guard, load from the top. It has a bayonet. So the British are already kind of thinking ahead with this. That Ferguson rifle is definitely way ahead of its time. Is way too complicated, I think, for widespread battlefield use in the 18th century. But some of the pattern 76 rifle that they developed and so forth leads to the Baker rifle, which of course will dominate the battlefield during the Napoleonic Wars. And anyone who's ever watched any of the Sharp movies knows all about that,
You must have a sixth sense, buddy, because Christopher Ware just came on and asked if you could talk about the Ferguson rifle, and you immediately went into it.
Yeah, the Ferguson rifle is so cool. Again, like I said, tremendous rate of fire. It really is an effective weapon. The problem is, first of all, it was complicated to manufacture. And secondly, with the mechanism, it was very hard to maintain in the field. It wasn't really ideal for hard campaigning. So,
yeah. And this is in an era where there's no mass-produced parts, so you're gonna have to, work with it as best as you can, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're at the very beginning of the kind of industrial revolution, so parts are still, they're being made according to patterns, they're being made according to specifications, but they're still largely being made by hand or being like stamped out by water powered machinery and things like that. So it's very difficult. One of the reasons probably why the rifle did not see more widespread use, other than the drawbacks in terms of accurate or of rate of fire, is that it's more complicated to manufacture.
What as they're moving forward and they get, basically captured and slaughtered in New York, those who come out of it, later on or whenever it may be, what is their kind of like a legacy of this whole ordeal?
Well, I think the rifleman in general becomes very much an American icon. We going into the 19th century and the 20th century, we like to think we won the American Revolution by hiding behind rocks and trees because, we were smarter than the British who would stand there in their bright red uniforms like idiots.
Yeah, and just take it.
Which, is very far from the truth. The Continental Army wins the war because it learns to fight like an effective European army. And as I said, the rifleman is a romantic legend. Again, we don't like to think about the average soldier who stood there in line with hundreds or thousands of other average soldiers. We like to think of the one badass who can take out the enemy from 300 yards away. Because I think it's a much more powerful idea in some ways that one single person can have such an effect on history. The guy that takes out Fraser at Saratoga, I know there's some competing claims as to who it is, or probably we'll never actually know who it was, but, these people become folk heroes. The idea of, again, look at the media or popular culture that surrounds the 18th century. I mean, think about a movie like The Patriot. Aim small, miss small, because like the most quoted line in that movie. And it's, this guy is totally built on this archetype of the American rifleman. You can go to like Last of the Mohicans, right. Hawkeye is clearly based on this kind of legendary frontiersman. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, anyone who's watched that Disney movie from the 60s knows, he's the king of the wild frontier.
Yeah.
But that's a direct lineage back to these guys. If you look at state seals, which is kind of a weird thing, but like I noted, like the Kentucky state seal is a guy in a hunting shirt. West Virginia, guy in a hunting shirt. WVU's mascot, the Mountaineer, he's a guy in a hunting shirt with a rifle.
Yeah.
This is a powerful image. We like to think of ourselves as, ordinary people capable of extraordinary things, and that one person could change the course of a battle or of a war. It's a very powerful image.
So with people wanting to learn more about it, what are some books you like? What are some memoirs you like? What are some things like that you really take an interest in?
I would absolutely recommend, there's a biography of Daniel Morgan that came out. Actually, I've got it on my shelf right now. Hold on.
Go ahead. We usually have Pete Carmichael on here pulling books, so we're used to it.
So Daniel Morgan by Albert Zambone.
Okay.
I want to say Zamboni, like the
Yeah.
Really good recent biography of Morgan. It talks a lot about his experiences during the war, including the Beeline March. Excuse me. And a lot of his later impact on the war. As I said, out of those 4 officers, he's really the only one that goes on to any sort of fame. And, he goes on to become one of Washington's most trusted and most capable subordinates during the war. That's a really good one. The memoir that I mentioned, Henry Bedinger, that was published in a history of Shepherdstown back in the 1920s, early 20th century. And I'll post that to your page because I can't think of the title right now, but it does have his account, and then it also has some accounts later on from the 19th century of people talking about the veterans of this march and so forth. These guys, certainly the ones who survived, became legends in their communities, and really, as I said, national legends. People, when we think of Revolutionary War soldiers, I think a lot of people, their mind immediately goes to these rough frontiersmen, these individuals.
Yeah, and it's usually the hunting shirt still is what people think of with the rebellion. Is, you know, it's the quintessential continental soldier is wearing one of those. That's what people just automatically go to.
Yep.
Yeah, so its legacy must still stick with us pretty hard. We're still thinking about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Do you have any last things you want to talk about, or one last myth you need to dispel about these guys, or
If anyone out there's got
about the
any
period?
questions or anything they want me to expand on, I'm happy to do that.
Well, yeah, people are glad that you pulled out Zamboni.
Okay.
Uh, uh,
Yeah, it's a great read, really good book.
here's a good one. How do these 10 companies overall of riflemen, how do they influence military tactics? Well, we kind of went over that, but you know, they sounds like they did a whole hell of a lot for tactics going forward. At least I'm thinking of like War of 1812 and stuff like that.
So one of the big lessons that they learn with the riflemen is you can't just have like a whole army of riflemen. I mean, it sounds very attractive to the modern mind. These guys are so accurate and capable of, you know, hitting such a distance. But as the war goes on, Washington and other generals will actually start ordering that rifle companies be reissued muskets. They almost hit a critical mass with riflemen where, you know, as I said, they're just not able to make you stand on a battlefield against, you know, a contemporary enemy. You know, volume of fire and the ability to bring a large amount of firepower to bear at any one point is really the name of the game in linear warfare. And so what both sides will find as the war goes on, and as I alluded to earlier, is that riflemen are great in small numbers. You know, they're a force multiplier. They can augment a conventional army's ability to operate. You know, they will certainly find a lot of use as scouts, you know, ahead of the main army, on the flanks of the main army. You know, the Revolutionary War is not a big cavalry war. So they will almost replace cavalry in a lot of ways. You know, they will be operating independently, kind of on the flanks and in the fore, scouting, screening against the enemy, skirmishing with the enemy. But when it comes to the actual heavy fighting of the war, you know, they kind of occupy a secondary role. So again, very useful. I'm not trying to tear down the riflemen. They certainly had their place on the 18th century battlefield. It's something that, as I said, you know, the British and the Americans really figure out as the war goes on. But they're not necessarily capable of standing on their own, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Would you say, as we close up here in a few minutes, would you say that we talk about the colonists, colonial forces, kind of adapting to warfare? You know, they're getting more linear and they're learning European style warfare and stuff like that. Would you say the British are doing the same thing as far as the American style of warfare? They're kind of evolving as well. There's a distinct American style of warfare, and it's kind of like does everybody evolve and meet in the middle?
Yeah. So the British were no strangers to that style of warfare. You know, of course, they had fought in North America just, you know, 20 years earlier in the French and Indian War. Many of the British officers who were commanding troops in America had seen service in that war. There's also a lot of kind of military theory coming out of Eastern Europe at the time, you know, the Balkans and the Austrian Empire and stuff, where they're using these Jaegers and other light troops, riflemen. And that's really kind of swirling around in the general military science of the day. And so what the British will do during the early years of the revolution is, you know, as I said, they get very aggressive because they realize that the Americans don't tend to, you know, once combat becomes very close range, the Americans will flee. So again, they're moving very, very quickly. They're moving very, very aggressively. They're using their best troops, you know, their light infantry, their grenadiers, as, you know, basically a fist to bash through the Americans. The Americans scatter and run. It's not and the British are very quick in America to adapt open order. So instead of standing shoulder to shoulder, they're standing with gaps between the men. They go from a 3-rank lines down to 2 ranks, just more flexible. They're not necessarily firing big, massive volleys. They're firing as individuals at picking their targets. They're working on their marksmanship. They absolutely adapt using the lessons that they learned in the French and Indian War, using what they're learning from continental Europe. They adapt to this kind of warfare very quickly. The Americans figured out the best way to stop that is by concentrating their firepower, by having solid lines of men who can lay down a lot of lead very quickly. One of my favorite books on the topic, since you asked for book recommendations, there is a book called With Zeal and Bayonets Only by Matthew Spring. That book really dispels a lot of the myths of the British Army during the Revolution. Taking eyewitness accounts, taking what's actually going on, written by participants, and showing that they weren't just these mindless automatons marching in lines to be slaughtered by the Americans, but are really, really quick and very keen to adapt and fighting in a very different way than I think we picture in our minds. So.
It's such an interesting time period, and I've often said, I've heard that and I've read that about the British, kind of molding a new fighting style to meet the threat, and to go with it. And I've always said to people, I'm like, just because they wore red doesn't mean they were on Star Trek. They're not just going to stand there and take it. Just be like the guys that die first.
Yeah, I mean, they were a professional army with a professional officer class who knew how to adapt on the battlefield. I mean, that's true of the Americans. It's equally true of the British.
Yeah. And I love listening to them, how they adapted their uniforms, because that's just my jam. If it's material culture, I'm there. And some of the things they do is amazing. But
yeah, the British are, again, very quickly to adapt. Grenadiers will get rid of those tall bearskin caps. The light infantry go the shortcut, very, very shortcut coats, round hats, long gaitered trousers as opposed to knee breeches, just because it's so much more practical when you're out in the American wilderness fighting. And you see that time and again.
Yeah, adapting.
And got to check out With Zeal and Bayonets Only. Great book. Real eye opener as far as a British perspective on the war.
Yeah, we'll have to put a link to that one too in the comment section here. But Travis, I really appreciate your time, brother. I appreciate getting us back into 18th century now. Because
anytime, man. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, man, it's been great. We have a lot of great people in the comment section I want to get to. Not a lot of questions tonight, but a lot of great comments. I think we'll go over the next couple of days. We'll catch up with you all on that front. But again, Travis, thanks for letting us know about the Beeline March and what was going on in 1775 and the epic and myth of the rifleman in American history.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, buddy. Hey, everybody, take care. Hope you have a wonderful night. Stay tuned for more live streams later this week from both of us. I think you guys have one tomorrow night.
Yeah, tomorrow night we are doing our weekly Historians on Tap over at Mosby Heritage Area, and that is this week's theme is actually on song and dance, so local influences on music. We're going to have some musicians with us playing some great tunes, talking about the impact of Virginians on music. So it'll be a really cool one. So I hope you tune in.
Awesome. Great job. All right. Hey, thanks everybody again for tuning in. Hope you have a wonderful night. Travis, thanks so much, brother.
Thank you. Take care, bud.